Hi, today I'm going to present a research conducted by Brossolet, Clémentine Chelins, and Catherine Elzen. This work is about making smart meters acceptable and will more specifically focus on the end-user standpoint. This research is based on the observation that 40 to 50% of the world energy consumption is related to the building stock. According to previous life cycle analysis, a large proportion of the total energy consumption comes from the operation phase of the building. This represents 40 to 90% of the global consumption, depending on the configuration, for lifetimes ranging from 40 to 100 years. There is therefore a great need to quantify and study this phase of building operation, which is expected to be facilitated by smart meters. A smart meter is a device for monitoring energy consumption in real time. Compared to a traditional electric meter, there is a possibility of in- and outgoing communication with the supplier and the network manager. Such a device has an interface adapted to the user's expectations, which allows regular feedback on their consumption. It also provides advice on how to regulate it, as well as comparisons with other households. These smart meters lead to an economy of scale and to a greater accuracy of consumption peaks on the network. They are also of interest at the household level to control individual consumption. In the literature, there is still little consideration for user-oriented aspects compared to technical approaches, despite the great importance of acceptability for the adoption of these devices. About 50% of the scientific articles are technical, the other half are divided into economic and social aspects. The question then arises, will people accept these devices and integrate them into their consumption routines, or will they massively reject them, as was the case in France? The active involvement of users is necessary to take into account the social acceptability of smart meters. This implies giving value to the mental representation of these objects, the associated behaviors, its usability, and its utility. Our study is based on Davis' technology acceptance model. This model relies on two main factors. First, the perceived usefulness. How much do I think I will be able to reduce my consumption by using a smart meter? Second, the perceived ease of use. How easy and simple do I think it will be to use a smart meter? These two factors and other various external factors then induce an intention to use the object or to implement the behavior. This intention is then translated into actual system use. Davis' model thus proposes a technocratic approach to acceptability. The smart meter is a technological device, but it influences the way the user will manage his or her consumption more than the consumption itself. This model is therefore appropriate, but it is interesting to complement it with Elzen's research. Elzen's theory of blind behavior considers three factors which influence behavioral intention. First, the attitude toward the behavior. What do I think about this behavior? Second, the subjective norm. What will my relatives or some authority think if I perform this behavior? Third, perceived control over the behavior. How complex do I think it will be to perform this behavior? Both behavioral intention and actual control over the behavior determine the actual system use. Thus, Elzen's theory does not establish a direct link between intention and behavior. It takes into account social norms towards ecology and low perceived control. The results are therefore more accurate, and we decide to combine the two models. More recent research in the field of smart meters adds the notion of compartmentalization. This is a cognitive fragmentation of values, behaviors, or identities coexisting within a single individual in order to better conform to a given context and social norm. When an individual acts against one of his or her values to better adapt to the context, he or she is performing compartmentalization. We then observe a dissociation between the abstract theory of ecology and the very concrete everyday life. This phenomenon of compartmentalization makes it possible to hide the less eco-responsible aspects of our energy practices and thus to preserve the perceived normality of our behaviors. Other factors may complete the model, such as the issue of privacy and trust in energy suppliers. Our research is conducted in Wallonia, the French-speaking part of Belgium. We formulate three main research questions. First, how do Walloon people feel about smart meters related behavior nowadays? Then, which factors affect the acceptability of smart meters implementation at a household level? And finally, can smart meters initiate users' behavioral changes in energy practices? This research uses a hybrid methodology that is both qualitative and quantitative. First, we organized 2 participatory workshops with a total of 16 citizens. They answered a small survey and discussed about their perceptions of smart meters. The 2 workshops gathered different participants with either a naive or a professional perspective towards smart meters. In a second phase, we also distributed an online questionnaire that collected about 120 valid responses. The data were analyzed using an exploratory approach. Indeed, the workshops aimed at establishing hypotheses which were then tested through the large-scale survey. The quantitative results were moreover nuanced by some qualitative insights. The quantitative data from the survey were subjected to multi-factor analysis of variance. We first note that the respondents are mostly early adopters as the data collection method is online. The respondents therefore come from a rather young and technophile population. We tested several socio-demographic criteria: gender, number of inhabitants in the household, status of owner or tenant, and level of education. None of these variables had a significant influence on the results. The level of information is rather low, but the smart meters are nevertheless rather well perceived. Note that there is no correlation between these two aspects. According to our qualitative results, we observe more reluctance towards smart meters. In particular, participants are concerned about the type of data provided, which is sometimes considered too sensitive, too personal, and usable for purposes they do not know. They also express a certain lack of trust in the actors who collect them. We also identify a lack of information about scales. The participants are not always aware of the consumption of the smart meter itself in relation to the total consumption of the house and in relation to the possible energy savings. There is also a gap between technophobes and technophiles. Some participants wonder to what extent the smart meter is not a technological headlong rush rather than a real way to change our energy behaviors. Our statistical results also show that there is no correlation between the intention to use a smart meter and the level of information. This is in line with previous research on compartmentalization. Indeed, Barthiau has shown that only 11% of the end users will take into account the theoretical information provided to them in order to put a behavior into practice. In our case, a better knowledge about smart meters does not imply a more immediate intention to use it. We now look at the different factors from our model that have an impact on the acceptability of smart meters. The graph represents the perceived impact of these factors on behavioral change according to the respondents. First of all, we find that the information provided has more impact when it comes from the user's entourage or from an expert in the field. On the contrary, respondents give less credence to information from their neighbors. Thus, comparing consumption among neighbors is less likely to lead to behavioral change than comparing it with people close to them. During the workshops, participants felt that comparison is not worthwhile if it creates guilt, but it can be really beneficial if the goal is to set an example. Second, the factors that respondents believe have the most impact are related to the perceived usefulness of the behaviors. Users therefore place a lot of importance on the environmental and financial usefulness of the smart meter and the eco-friendly behaviors it enables. Be careful, however, because this notion of environmental utility probably induces a significant social desirability bias. Environmental issues will therefore probably have less influence than that reported by the respondents. Third, perceived behavioral control is one of the most influential factors for respondents. According to them, the smart meter can lead to empowerment as they get more control over their energy consumption. However, the smart meter can also lead to a loss of control if it's difficult to use, for example. Therefore, perceived control is an ambivalent factor that is perceived both positively and negatively. This same factor can lead to both acceptability and rejection of the smart meter and its associated behaviors. Finally, the recreational aspect of the smart meter can have a high impact on behavior change. Workshop participants explained that a playful interface would encourage them to adopt a new behavior. In particular, they cited eco-friendly search engines such as Ecosia, which plants a tree for every 45 queries. We now move to the discussion. One of the highlights of this research is the cognitive compartmentalization of users with respect to environmental information. The smart meter allows to overcome this phenomenon by proposing a more synthetic information, more concrete and closer to the daily reality. It is therefore necessary to keep the reflection at a very practical level to increase the perceived usefulness. For instance, the interface can advise to run the washer 1 hour later and explain that this action is equivalent to saving 3 polar bears per month or 12 euros per month. The flexibility of the interface can also make it easier to use and thus generate a more positive attitude towards behavioral changes. Moreover, users can develop a sense of pride when they adopt environmentally responsible behaviors. From a social point of view, comparison with peers can therefore be constructive and moreover foster an intergenerational bond. Indeed, the idea of giving a clean planet to their children and grandchildren can motivate the adoption of smart meters. During the focus groups, participants felt that it would be good for children to empower their parents and positively influence their behavior. This progressive empowerment can be facilitated through gamification and progressive rewards. It is important that the youngest empower the adults, but it's also important to avoid the effects of intrusive interference, loss of autonomy, and guilt. The goal is not to control their daily lives, but to make them aware of alternative behaviors. Finally, it's essential to keep a human touch in the loop to promote a sense of control, ease of use, and social support. The smart meter is therefore not enough on its own, but requires a concrete interface that generates a parent-child interaction and a recreational spirit. The best solutions generally use several of the identified factors at the same time. In addition, the different sources of information must converge in order to combat compartmentalization, poor perceived control, and feelings of powerlessness in relation to ecological issues. To conclude, we will answer the three initial research questions. Regarding the perception of Walloon citizens, they are rather favorable to the implementation of a smart meter in their homes. Nevertheless, they are generally not very well informed about the subject and have some doubts about its relevance. Concerning the factors impacting acceptability, we identified three main influential factors: the perceived environmental usefulness, the perceived financial usefulness, and the perceived behavioral control. Regarding the potential of smart meters to change our energy behavior, we note two elements. First, behavioral change is more likely to happen when several acceptability factors are combined. Second, behavioral change is facilitated by a convergence of information from a variety of sources. Finally, we highlight the limitation of our study that lead to a positive perception of smart meters, probably above average. Indeed, the workshop participants and the survey respondents were recruited on a voluntary basis and have a particular sensitivity for environmental issues. All of our results should therefore be treated with caution, considering that they come from a highly aware population. For more information, the master thesis of Brossolet is available online in French. Thank you all for your attention.